What if the most effective way to win was not exposing them, not confronting them, and not even trying to be understood by them, but instead reaching a state where they can no longer emotionally reach you at all? Because the reality is uncomfortable. These narcissistic patterns do not break because of punishment. They break when they become irrelevant. And the moment you become emotionally unreachable, something changes that they cannot control anymore. If this is beginning to make sense, pause for a moment and reflect. In which areas of your life are you still trying to be understood by someone who seems committed to misunderstanding you? And if you are ready, consider subscribing, because what follows is about learning how to fully step out of that cycle. These patterns are mainly powered by emotional supply. This means the whole system relies on your emotional reactions in order to keep going. This supply is not only positive attention like praise, approval, or validation. It also includes negative emotional reactions such as anger, frustration, confusion, or even long explanations where you try to defend yourself or make things clear. From the outside, it may look like simple arguments or misunderstandings, but psychologically, any strong emotional reaction becomes fuel. That fuel keeps the cycle alive and keeps you involved in it. Even painful experiences can unintentionally strengthen the pattern because they show that emotional engagement is still active. When you react strongly, defend yourself again and again, or try to correct false narratives, you are still inside the loop. This is why these interactions often feel exhausting and repetitive. There is rarely any real closure because the goal of the pattern is not understanding or resolution. The goal is continued emotional stimulation. Over time, this builds a habit in your nervous system where it stays alert, reactive, and emotionally tied to their behavior. The real shift starts when you begin removing that automatic emotional response. This does not require confrontation or sudden separation. It begins internally, in small moments where you notice a trigger and choose not to react instantly. Instead of reacting right away, you pause and create space between what happens and how you respond. That space is powerful because it interrupts the cycle. It removes the predictable emotional reaction that the pattern depends on. As this continues, your experience of the dynamic slowly changes. The same words, tones, or behaviors that once felt overwhelming start to lose their impact because they are no longer reinforced by your immediate reaction. What begins to develop is not just distance, but a kind of psychological detachment. Their attempts to provoke you no longer reach you in the same direct way. The strongest change in these dynamics happens when you stop being emotionally available in the way the system expects. Emotional availability here does not only mean being kind or open. It means being instantly reachable at the level of reaction, interpretation, and emotional investment whenever they speak or act. When that availability is constant, the pattern stays alive, even if it feels chaotic, because there is always an emotional entry point. But when you begin to withdraw that availability, the structure of the interaction changes. Instead of immediately reacting, explaining, defending, or emotionally processing everything in real time, you begin to introduce delay and distance between trigger and response. That interruption is important because it breaks the expectation of instant emotional access. Without that access, the interaction loses power, even if the other person's behavior does not change immediately. This shift is not about becoming cold or pretending to not care. It is about no longer offering your emotional system on demand. Over time, this creates a mismatch between what the old pattern expects and what it receives now. Instead of strong emotional reactions, there is calmness, neutrality, restraint, or simple non-engagement. That reduction in emotional feeding slowly weakens the cycle because it was never built on logic or understanding, but on repeated emotional exchange. In these dynamics, attention is not neutral at all. It acts like psychological currency that keeps the system running, whether the attention is positive or negative. Many people assume only admiration, agreement, or validation feeds the cycle, but intense negative attention can be just as powerful in keeping it alive. When you argue, try to defend yourself repeatedly, plead your case, or attempt to correct distorted stories, you are still giving attention and emotional energy. From the perspective of the pattern, this is still supply because it confirms that the emotional connection is active and important enough to keep you engaged. This is why trying harder to explain yourself often leads to more frustration instead of clarity. The problem is not that your truth has no value, but that the system is not built around mutual understanding. It is built around emotional activation and continued involvement. Every reaction becomes something that sustains the cycle, even if that reaction is pain, anger, or disagreement. Over time, this creates a confusing experience where the more you try to fix things or make them clear, the more emotionally trapped you feel inside it. The change begins when you realize that attention itself is the resource being pulled into the dynamic, not just approval or affection. Once this becomes clear, you start to understand that stepping back is not about denying reality, but about refusing to feed a process that depends on your emotional investment. Even small adjustments like not replying immediately or not engaging every time something is said to provoke you begin to reduce the available emotional supply. As that supply decreases, the intensity of the pattern also decreases because it was never powered by resolution, only by continued reaction. Boundaries in these situations are often misunderstood. People think of them as words, statements, or rules that are spoken clearly. But in reality, boundaries only become meaningful when they are backed by consistent action. A boundary that is only spoken but not enforced is not really a structure. It is just an idea. In emotionally manipulative or highly conflicted patterns, inconsistency actually strengthens the cycle. When limits are not applied the same way every time, the system learns that those limits are flexible. It learns that they can be tested again and again until they weaken or disappear. When boundaries are inconsistent, Your own nervous system also becomes unstable.
In one moment, you may feel firm and clear,
And in the next moment, emotion takes over, leading to partial enforcement or re engagement. This back and forth does not create safety or protection. It creates predictability for more testing. The other person does not respond mainly to what you say, but to what you repeatedly allow over time. This is why inconsistency has a stronger effect than the words of the boundary itself. Real change begins when boundaries are supported by steady follow-through, even in small situations. This can look like ending a conversation when it becomes disrespectful, not replying to messages that are clearly baiting a reaction, or refusing to re-enter a pattern that has already been recognized. The key is not intensity, but consistency. Repetition builds structure. Consistency removes confusion. And without confusion, there is less room for manipulation or shifting interpretations of your limits. Over time, this creates a new relational structure where access is no longer automatic or driven by emotion. Instead of negotiating your limits in moments of pressure, you define them through your behavior in advance. This reduces the effectiveness of old patterns because they can no longer rely on testing to find weak points. Detachment is often mistaken for emotional shutdown or becoming cold, but it is not that. Real detachment is internal clarity. It is the state where you are no longer emotionally entangled in another person's reactions. Confrontation often keeps you inside the same emotional field because it requires ongoing engagement, explanation, and response. Even when confrontation feels justified or necessary, it still keeps your attention focused on the other person's behavior. That keeps the psychological connection active. Detachment shifts that focus back to you. It returns your attention to your own internal state, your own response, and your own emotional stability, rather than the constant pull of reacting to someone else. When you begin practicing detachment, the aim is not to push down or suppress your emotions, but to stop organizing your actions and behavior around them. You may still experience anger, sadness, frustration, or confusion in the same way as before. The difference is that these emotions no longer automatically turn into actions directed at the other person. Instead of reacting outwardly right away, you begin to observe inwardly, allowing emotions to rise, move through you, and then fall on their own without converting them into engagement or response. This creates a small but important pause between feeling and reaction. And over time, that pause slowly reduces the intensity of the emotional dynamic. Confrontation often feels like it brings resolution, and it creates the illusion that something has been settled or cleared. But in many repetitive relational patterns, confrontation actually restarts the cycle because it reopens emotional exchange and keeps the connection active in the same way. Detachment avoids that restart. It removes the constant need to prove something, to correct someone, or to emotionally resolve an issue with a person who may not be operating from a place of mutual understanding or emotional balance. This is not avoidance driven by fear or weakness, but recognition that continued emotional engagement is not producing meaningful change or progress. As detachment becomes stronger, what changes most is not the behavior of the other person, but your internal dependency on their reactions, their words, tone, silence, or attempts to provoke you begin to lose their ability to pull you into immediate emotional movement. That reduction in reactivity is where the real shift takes place, because it removes the leverage that once sustained the entire dynamic in the first place. Healing in these kinds of dynamics is not only about recovering from what happened in the past. It is also about actively interrupting the psychological loop that kept you emotionally attached to the experience. When a person stays stuck in repeated reflection, replaying conversations, analyzing intentions, or searching for hidden meanings, the mind continues to remain engaged with the same emotional system that originally created distress. Even when the intention behind this thinking is to understand or make sense of what happened, the effect can still be that the emotional connection remains active because attention is continuously directed back toward the source of injury. True healing begins when awareness shifts away from the other person's behavior and moves toward your own internal experience and response patterns. This means noticing how your nervous system reacts, how quickly you become emotionally activated, and how often your thoughts return to the same situation again and again. Instead of trying to solve the external story or decode every detail of what the other person did, you start recognizing the internal cycle that keeps replaying it inside you. That recognition is important because it moves your sense of control away from what you cannot change and brings it back toward what you can influence, which is your present response and awareness. As healing progresses, the emotional charge attached to memories slowly begins to decrease. What once felt urgent, heavy, or emotionally consuming starts to feel more distant or less intense, not because it has been erased or forgotten, but because it is no longer constantly reinforced through attention and reaction. This reduction in emotional reinforcement is what weakens the loop over time. The brain gradually stops treating the experience as an active threat that requires ongoing analysis, emotional preparation, or mental resolution. Over time, this process creates more internal space, where your attention is no longer dominated by the past interaction or its emotional echo. Instead, energy begins to return to your present life, your daily choices, and your sense of stability. The loop does not break through one single moment of insight, but through repeated withdrawal of emotional investment until the experience no longer defines your internal state or emotional identity. Predictability is one of the core mechanisms that keeps manipulative, repetitive, or emotionally volatile dynamics functioning. When your reactions are predictable, your emotional responses become easy to anticipate, trigger, and manage within the interaction. Over time, certain words, tones, silences, behaviors, or patterns begin to reliably produce emotional output. This predictability is rarely random. It is what allows the cycle to continue smoothly without requiring constant adjustment from either side. When someone understands, consciously or unconsciously, how you are likely to respond, they can shape interactions in ways that activate those responses again and again. When you begin to change your predictability, the entire dynamic starts to lose its efficiency and stability. This does not require dramatic changes in personality or emotional expression. Instead, it involves subtle shifts, such as pausing before responding, delaying replies, not engaging with every provocation, or choosing neutrality in moments where reaction used to happen automatically. These small and consistent changes disrupt the expected sequence of interaction. The other person no longer receives the same immediate emotional feedback, and because of that, their usual strategies become less effective over time. As predictability weakens, confusion can temporarily increase in the dynamic because the established pattern no longer works in a reliable way. Attempts that once triggered strong reactions may now produce little or no effect. This mismatch forces a kind of recalibration in the interaction. However, the most important shift is not in how the other person adjusts, but in your own reduced emotional participation. You are no longer reinforcing the cycle through automatic emotional output, and that gradually changes the structure of the interaction itself. Eventually, what begins to form is a state of emotional neutrality, where your responses are no longer easily predicted, mapped, or influenced in the same way as before. This does not mean that you stop feeling emotions altogether, but rather that there is a reduction in automatic emotional exposure and automatic reaction. In that space, old patterns begin to lose their hold because they depend heavily on repetition and predictable feedback loops. Without that repetition, the pattern starts to weaken naturally over time. Your silence and your emotional steadiness become powerful, not because they are used as a strategy or a form of control, but because they reflect a real shift in where your emotional energy is being invested. Instability in a dynamic often creates openings for continued engagement because emotional fluctuation provides material for reaction, interpretation, and re-entry into the cycle. When your internal state becomes steadier, less reactive, and less influenced by external provocation, those openings gradually close. Silence in this sense is not about punishment, manipulation, or sending a message to the other person. It is about removing unnecessary emotional participation from interactions that once consumed a large amount of your internal energy. When silence is combined with emotional stability, it signals that the previous access points no longer function in the same way. There is no longer a need to explain, defend, or emotionally process every attempt to provoke a reaction. This absence of reaction often changes the dynamic more than confrontation ever could, because it removes the feedback loop entirely. Stability also means that your internal state is no longer easily disrupted by familiar triggers. What once created urgency, stress, or emotional escalation begins to feel less compelling, not because you are forcing yourself to ignore it, but because it simply no longer carries the same psychological weight it once did. This shift develops gradually through repeated experiences of choosing not to engage emotionally with patterns that once had control over your attention. In the end, the real transformation in these dynamics is not about defeating someone, exposing them, or making them feel the same emotions you once felt.
It is about stepping completely out of the emotional system that kept you tied to the cycle in the first place. These patterns survive and continue to function through reaction, attention, predictability, and emotional investment. The moment those elements begin to fade, the structure that once felt overwhelming and consuming starts to lose its grip naturally, without force, argument, or confrontation. What replaces that cycle is not emptiness, but clarity and internal space. You begin to understand that closure does not come from being understood by someone who was never fully engaged in understanding you in the first place. It comes from no longer needing that understanding in order to move forward with your life. Your energy slowly shifts away from trying to manage, analyze, or decode another person's behavior and returns to your own emotional stability, boundaries, and inner peace. This process is not instant, and it does not move in a perfectly straight line. There are moments of doubt, emotional pullback, and temporary return to old patterns of thinking. But with consistency over time, each moment where you choose non-reaction, each boundary you maintain, and each decision to disengage internally strengthens your sense of self. The dynamic loses importance, not because the other person changes, but because you no longer participate in the emotional exchange that once sustained it. Ultimately, the most powerful outcome is not their awareness of loss or change, but your lived experience of freedom. When your inner world is no longer shaped or controlled by their actions, reactions, or presence, the cycle ends in the only way that truly matters, through your return to yourself.